So in April 1940, Britain's cabinet was made up of a load of old men, or at least that's how this newspaper is describing them. Although it then goes on and says that they have an average age of 55, which, to be honest, I wouldn't have thought is all that old, at least not by modern standards. But then again, I mean, back in 1940, the average life expectancy of a man was around 60, whereas today it's more like 80. So I guess 55 was pretty old back in those days. So this article says, an old man's team runs wartime Britain. Average age of the 8 members of the War Cabinet is 55. Prime Minister Chamberlain is the oldest at 71. The youngest, prematurely white-haired, is 46-year-old War Minister Oliver Stanley. Last week they carried on like youngsters living on snacks and sleeping in snatches. At the Air Ministry, newly appointed Sir John Hoare, aged 60, found himself sleeping on a truckle bed in his room and being roused from his fitful slumbers at 5:30 each morning by a messenger. Mr. Stanley spent most of every 24 hours in his room at the War Office, but generally managed to slip home by car to Dean Stanley Street behind Westminster Abbey for a few hours' sleep, a bath and a shave. Chief of the Imperial General Staff, grizzled campaigner Sir Edmund Ironside, continued to use the camp bed, which has stood in front of his desk since the war began 7 months ago. Mr. Chamberlain again showed his remarkable constitution by passing through the most strenuous week of the war without the least sign of wilting. The Premier can cut down his sleep to a few hours. Most mornings he had his valet call him with a cup of tea at 6 o'clock, though he never went to bed until past midnight. At short notice, he had his War Cabinet colleagues sitting in urgent conference in number 10 Downing Street by 8:30 a.m, when most Britons were still gulping their breakfasts. First Lord Churchill has frequently worried his friends in recent months by running around the drafty corridors of the Admiralty in his dressing gown and slippers at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning in search of the latest news. For several nights last week, he got less sleep than any member of the War Cabinet, but made up for his night's loss by extending his customary after-luncheon nap. I mean, the thing I find curious is the fact that the newspaper would even write an article like this. It's really hard to imagine in the modern world any newspaper writing such a flattering article about the sleeping habits of our leading politicians. You know, and I've no doubt that there are times when leading politicians do go without sleep, but, you know, they don't get commended like this in the press. We then have a title, Criticisms. Although wearied by his exertions, Winston Churchill was the most confident of all the ministers, with the possible exception of Neville Chamberlain himself, that the British initiative had at last firmly got a grip on Germany's vitals. Nevertheless, this did not relieve the Prime Minister and his First Lord of criticism. Churchill was attacked because the Germans were able to slip past the British naval units and land troops in Norway. Chamberlain was being hammered for not forming a proper war cabinet of thinkers and planners without departmental responsibilities. Observing that Hitler's Sitzkrieg, Sitzkrieg means a war where there's not a lot happening, it's just kind of a gentle war. Observing that Hitler's Sitzkrieg might soon develop into a desperate blitzkrieg, being a much more violent approach to war. Affable Vernon Bartlett. Vernon Bartlett was a journalist and a backbench MP, and he's long been a student of foreign affairs, including a period when he was violently pro-German in his BBC broadcasts, and is now an independent member of Parliament. He wrote to the Times as follows: "To answer the blitzkrieg effectively, or to take the initiative, we shall have a greater need of close cooperation between the service departments, i.e. the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Economic Warfare, the Ministry of Information and so on, than ever before." The Winston Churchill who addressed the House yesterday was, not surprisingly, a very tired man. He would have to be superhuman in order to control the work of the Navy in what may be the most varied and dangerous campaign of its long history, and at the same time to contribute all that he might otherwise do to the coordination of our war strategy in other fields as well. May I therefore make a fresh appeal for the immediate formation of a small war cabinet, including only ministers without administrative worries. He then says, "I speak to a large number of very varied audiences, and I find the surest way of winning applause is to make this exact point. The applause is repeated when I add that the Cabinet should not include ministers who, rightly or wrongly, are considered at home and abroad to have lacked energy and courage in the past. And the applause has got all the greater since the last Mad Hatter's Tea Party, because the ordinary men in the street can't understand why ministers should be shifted around from one job to another. So the last Chamberlain reshuffle has clearly become known as the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. It then says Mr. Chamberlain resents this kind of reiterated criticism of his administration. He believes he knows best what is suited to the situation, but under pressure he might act. Belief in Whitehall is that the change around at the so-called Mad Hatter's Tea Party was made to strengthen Winston Churchill's hand in carrying out the strategic plan launched last week in Scandinavia. Contrary-wise, anti-Churchillians say Sir Samuel Hoare was appointed to the Air Ministry to watch Mr. Churchill and curb his enthusiasm for adventures in strategy. But this gossip does not stand to the test of facts. Winston Churchill, now chairman of the committee of the 3 service departments, went out of his way last fortnight to suggest that the Prime Minister should himself preside over its deliberations when important problems of strategy are being discussed. Assuming the success of the Scandinavian campaign, there is every reason to accept the political view that the Premier will eventually be compelled to form a small war cabinet in which Winston Churchill will sit as head of the 3 fighting services. If you enjoy this content, please take a look at my channel, not history but news. I'm going through a big box full of old newspapers that I found in an attic, and they're full of really interesting things like this. So please take a look, and if you enjoy it, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.